question on the motion? All in favor? Contrary? Carried unanimously. Councillor Louis.
Your Worship, I have a few inquiries. First of all, relating to the meeting that we held a couple of weeks ago. A couple of inquiries. The glass doors to this chamber were locked right up till 2 o'clock. We had hundreds of our citizens, our employers, waiting outside. We don't normally do that. Normally they're welcome here. They're allowed to come in and wait until we start at 2. My inquiry is this: whose decision was it to lock out the media, to lock out the public, to not let them come in until after we were all seated here in council, until after we actually started the council meeting?
I think it was a joint decision. I was involved in the decision with the city manager, with the people in charge of security and engineering and city clerk, and I don't know, a bunch of people got together and felt that that was the appropriate move to make. We made that decision that we should get councillors seated in their chairs before we opened this up to any number of people wanting to come in, and we felt it was public safety and for security reasons, and we all made that decision.
Well, I have no problem whatsoever with councillors being given time to get in here before the public comes in. Of course, I'm always early. I was here before 2 o'clock. But here's my question. If we lock the doors, whether for good reason or not, fair enough, why wouldn't we wait a minute or two to start the meeting once the doors are open? Why wouldn't we give people a couple of minutes to come in and get seated? Instead, what happened, and this leads to my next question, who approved the change of the agenda to drop the roll call, drop the prayer, and add Councillor McCormick's motion? The circulated agenda didn't have her motion there. We always do roll call. We always have a prayer. The one day that we don't is when the public wants to come on transit. Who approved that change?
That's probably me, and I probably would like to do it differently if I did it again, but we had a lot of hullabaloo and a lot of people, and I made quick decisions, and maybe they weren't entirely correct, but that's what happened.
All right, now my next
So you can blame me for it.
My next inquiry is to Mr. Rudberg, a director of Coast Mountain. You, if I recall correctly, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, were appointed rather recently, a couple of days into the strike. Councillor Puhle removed Councillor Clark from the board of Coast Mountain.
She resigned.
I'm asking, Your Worship, Councillor Puhle seems to be rather upset, and I'm certainly more than pleased to let him relax. So I'm going to wait here for a moment, and as soon as Your Worship tells me that I should proceed,
Yeah, proceed.
I will
Go ahead.
proceed.
You got a question, Mr. Rudberg? You have the floor. Go ahead.
Well, my question is for Mr. Rudberg. It's not for Councillor Puhle, and perhaps he could try a little harder to contain his outbursts. He's not a student in school. He's a councillor on City Council. Now, my question to Mr. Rudberg, and please correct me if I'm wrong, were you appointed by Mr. Puhle, were you appointed by TransLink on the board of Coast Mountain to replace Councillor Clark 2 days into the strike?
Yeah, I can say that I was appointed by the board as a director of the Coast Mountain, and I believe it was 2 or 3 days into the strike, something like that.
Were you told why it was necessary to remove directors that had been on the board of Coast Mountain for quite some period of time?
We have a point of order here.
Now, just...
No, point of order. We're allowed to have a point of order.
I have made it very clear in the past when asked. Nobody removed me. I resigned because of a conflict of interest that I was advised I had by 3 separate lawyers between the Wednesday preceding the strike and the Saturday, Sunday period. It became clear to me that I could not vote as the TransLink director to cut bus service, cut bus routes, which I was being asked to do on March 31st, which was hours before the strike, and which would trigger layoff notices, and which would impact on a collective agreement that as a Coast Mountain director, I was going to be trying to negotiate in good faith. I was advised that was a conflict of interest. I received a written legal opinion to that effect, and at my first opportunity, Monday morning at 9 a.m., I resigned from the Coast Mountain Bus Board. Nobody made me do it. other than my conscience and a legal opinion. Thank you.
Now, I'll have a couple of questions for the councillor that waited till the strike was 2 days old before she found out that she would be in a conflict of interest and didn't find out when she was first appointed to Coast Mountain whether or not there would be a conflict. I'll ask her those questions in a moment. But if I may briefly, Mr. Rudberg, back to you. Who do you report to? You're on the board of Coast Mountain. You're one of the directors. We have a very lengthy strike. We have a lot of suffering. We've all received over 1,000 emails in the last week alone from students, low-income people, people that truly are suffering. You're on the board of Coast Mountain. You could have accepted Mr. Reddy's report. It was a compromise report. You rejected it. Who do you report to in terms of making that decision?
Well, I think we're a board of directors, and we make decisions on the behalf of the Coast Mountain Bus Company. I guess ultimately I've been appointed by the TransLink board, and they can remove me if they want. The issues of bargaining strategy and is not discussed with TransLink, with members of TransLink, nor do we take instructions from TransLink with regard to the bargaining strategy or our mandate.
Do you discuss at all with TransLink whether or not they would be prepared, and if they would be prepared, what they would be prepared for Coast Mountain to accept?
No, I think those are decisions that are made by the directors of the Coast Mountain in terms of the bargaining mandate that we determine for our negotiators.
Nobody provides you with a mandate.
We're not provided with a mandate per se. I mean, we have a contract with TransLink in terms of providing service at certain service levels. We have ultimately a budget that we have to meet and so forth and so on.
Can you tell me why there is the application to the Supreme Court of British Columbia to stop the Labour Relations Board from deciding who the true employer is?
I can't speak for an application made by TransLink. I'm not a party of it. I haven't even read it. So I don't know.
All right, now no matter what the settlement, I take it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but no matter what the settlement, it's going to exceed the annual operating budget that Coast Mountain has been provided by TransLink. Is that not the case?
I think what would happen is that at some point in time, once we have the settlement, we would then be asked to provide a certain level of service, and we would then indicate to TransLink what the cost would be based on the labor contract, the cost of running the equipment, and so forth.
Exactly. You've articulated that much better than I would have. Let me put that back to make sure that I've understood. Once there is an agreement in place, you will then recalibrate the level of service that you're able to provide within that envelope of funding.
No, I think it would probably be, we would be mandated a certain level of service by the TransLink, and then we would have to calculate what that cost would be to deliver that service. And I think there would be some discussion back and forth on that issue.
I've got you. So you would, I guess what I'm wondering then is why wouldn't you be able to accept the mediator's report? TransLink then says to you, this is the level of service we want. You get out your calculator to the bean counting. With Reddy's report that we've just accepted, the cost will be X. And then the ball goes back into the court of TransLink.
I think there's a couple of difficulties with that from the perspective of the directors in Coast Mountain. One is that all of the kind of benefits, the wage increases, all of the other kinds of things provided to the drivers were provided up front. Issues around the kinds of offsetting cost savings that we needed to make sense in terms of providing the service were being deferred for 15 months or longer in terms of actual implementation, if any of them were approved. We weren't able to predict what our costs would be ultimately in the long term, but that was also a formula for a lot of unsettled labor relationships with our employees, because during that 15-month period when we were trying to negotiate it, I think there would be a potential for a lot of unhappiness and disruption, and what we didn't want another 15 months of turmoil with the potential uncertainty of what the end results would be. Because if we aren't able to agree, and we haven't been able to agree in the past discussions with the union, then we leave that in the hands of a third-party mediator, and there's a considerable amount of uncertainty around that. So those were the issues of concern to the directors.
What would the difference be in expense to Coast Mountain? The difference between your last offer and Mr. Reddy's recommendations per year?
I think in terms of costs, in terms of payments to the employees, was something in less than $1 million in terms of the benefit side of the equation. On the other side, the cost savings through improved work rules and so forth, which could amount up to as much as $8-9 million per year, just weren't there. It wasn't a couple of issues that were passed on to the mediator. It was virtually the entire agenda of the employer that was passed on to the agenda, to the mediation efforts, and then ultimately a decision by a third party.
What is your annual operating budget?
Oh, it's in the neighborhood of $350 million.
Here's my question. Many individuals have said to me that the savings available are not in the magnitude that Coast Mountain suggests. $9 to $10 million. But even if they are, let's assume that you're right and they're all wrong, $9 to $10 million in savings that won't be realized until the very earliest. The parties fail to reach an agreement. The arbitrator imposes a settlement. $9 to $10 million a year, plus the $1 million in benefits that the Reddy report would cost. It's a total of $10 million. $10 million on a base of how much? 300 and how many?
350 million.
10 million on a base of 350 million. What would that work out to? Is that about 3%?
That would be about 3%, yeah.
I just want to make sure that I've understood this correctly. We're currently 3 months into the strike. It's the longest strike that we've ever had. And the only reason is because the directors on the board of Coast Mountain are not prepared to accept a mediator's report that would, at most, even if we accept all the figures of Coast Mountain, the entire 9 or 10 million in savings that will not be realized, will at most increase your costs by 3%. I just want to go back to what you said a moment ago. If you accepted Mr. Reddy's recommendations, TransLink would then tell you what level of service they'd like you to provide. You would recalculate the cost of providing that service. It would now be 3% higher than it would have been otherwise. And then the ball would be in TransLink's court. Meanwhile, we've got all of this suffering, all of these senior citizens, all of these unemployed, all of these students, all of these businesses without transit for 3%. Why is that?
I think clearly, in terms of my involvement in the past with transportation services in the city for over 25 years, I personally am not insensitive to the transportation issues and the loss of service to the citizens and businesses within this community, and clearly that's one of the issues that is foremost in our minds as we work through this. But I think that there is an expectation as well on the public, not only the public that pays the fares, but the general taxpayers that support the transit system, that they expect to have the transit system run in a reasonably efficient way. And certainly with the work rules that are in there and the kind of legacy that we've inherited from the past, that we feel that those work rules, those inefficiencies, have to be corrected if the public, including the general taxpayer as well as the fare-paying public, need to have some confidence that in fact that system is operating efficiently. And I can assure you that it isn't today. And certainly with the kind of mandate that we provided, we hope to make some improvements in those efficiencies.
But isn't it open under Mr. Reddy's report? Under Reddy's report, he would, if the parties can't, he would recommend the removal of all of the work rules that are archaic and should be removed. All that would be required is for management to make its case to one of North America's most respected mediators, a neutral party. You tell the mediator, we haven't reached agreement with the union. Here is the list of the rules that we say need to be removed. If your argument makes sense, the very next day, by way of a binding decision on both parties, all of those rules evaporate in the time it would take Councillor Peel to pick up the phone and settle the dispute.
I think the issue for us, as I said earlier, is that it's 15 months of potential negotiations with the union that would then ultimately, if we can't reach agreement, go to a third-party mediator to decide.
I agree.
There's all kinds of uncertainty with regard to what the mediator may decide. And in fact, some of the issues that would be on the table, such as contracting out, are ones that you don't want to have a third party, I would suggest, writing rules about. It's something that all of the municipalities have resisted in all of its negotiations with its unions, to have certain issues like contracting out be left to a third party. We have consistently rejected that, and to put those kinds of issues with a mediator, I think would be a formula for potential disaster in terms of the company itself. I can't go into sort of the bargaining mandate that we have, but it's clearly our desire, our urge, everything we have is to get the parties back to the table so that we can bargain these issues. And I think that there is certainly flexibility in the employer's position, and we would expect to have the union back at the table so that the two parties can work out a fair solution to both sides that can begin to turn this company around in terms of its performance.
My very last question is this. You talked about the need for the public to be prepared to foot the bill, so to speak. If you were convinced that the public was overwhelming in its support of a return to work based on the Reddy report, even though that would increase your budget by 3%, and even though it would postpone to a later date the removal of the archaic rules, but they would be removed if they made sense to be removed, all you'd have to do is convince the arbitrator. If the public sent you that message, would you act on the public's wish, accept the mediator's report, and let the buses roll again?
Well,
Your
this
Worship,
is going to get, this is putting Mr. Rudberg in an awkward
Point of order.
position. This isn't fair.
Point of order.
No, yes, I recognize her. Point of order. She has a point of order, and I'm recognizing her. Go ahead. Your light is on, Councillor
All right.
Clark. Go
All
ahead.
right. I can actually read his thoughts there by his gestures and his words. Thank you. My question is, at this point, you are asking him to disclose things that really are part of labor management discussions. And I think you have got the answers to your questions generally, those things that can be disclosed in public. But I think you are crossing the line at the point at which you ask under what conditions would he do this or that with regard to this or that. I don't. Yes, indeed. And I think, Your Worship, the rest of this discussion is out of order. I think it's skated very close to the line. And I appreciate the public interest in this and the need for as much transparency as possible in a situation where there's tremendous suffering. And therefore, I've not objected before this. But I do believe your question is now out of order.
Yeah.
And I think that we should move on to other things.
I think we've got...
Okay,
I think we've got a time limit, and there is we would do it when we talk about the donators to our political campaign, and we know from your disclosure form that you got $176,000 from the union, and I think that at this point, out of your $276,000. So I think we've got to stick to your position here as a councillor. And I think we've got a little problem with the time. And I think we've got some other speakers. And I think it's appropriate because we don't want to hold the public up at 7:30 and it's now 47. So you're going to pick this up on Thursday. You'll have a chance, inquiries and other matters on Thursday. And you've pursued this extensively and had good coverage. And I'm going to have to rule that we move on to the next speaker. If there's still time before 7:30, maybe you want to continue. But I have other people that have comments they want to make on inquiries and other matters. And before this meeting is adjourned, I think we shall allow them, out of courtesy, a few minutes. And you're a reasonable person, and I know you'll agree with me. So I'm going to carry on with back to the queue.
Your Worship?
And deal with
Your Worship?
Deal with the next. I'll get back to you if we have time in a minute. Councillor McCormick. I'm coming back. Yes, I think it is out of order. I don't think it's fair to put Mr. Redberg in that position.
If it's out of order because it's not allowed per se, period, full stop, surely let me tell you briefly why I think it's not out of order. If it's out of order because we're running out of time,
No.
that's a different matter.
You got half a minute to convince me. 30 seconds to convince me. Go ahead.
I'm simply going to say I accept your ruling, no matter what it is, but I want to be clear what you're ruling on. You're ruling that my question to Mr. Redberg, the following question, if the public supported Reddy's report for getting it back to work, would you accept that? That was my question.
Okay.
You're ruling that question out of order.
Yes, because I think that the board is going to decide that.
I accept
You
your
can't
ruling.
answer that here. It's not
I
fair.
think you can, but you've ruled.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor McCormick.
Thank you. The issue that I want to raise is a public safety issue, which I'm concerned is very much out of control in this issue. Today on the east side of Vancouver, a 1-year-old baby was mauled by a coyote in front of the child's house. I believe it was in front of the house. There were 3 attacks last weekend. 3 years